Afternoon, and thank you for tuning in today to Lessons of Vietnam, where we try to tell the real story of the Vietnam War. Today is a special day. Not only is the show on, but today is the Army's birthday. So all you fellows and girls out there that have been in the Army, happy birthday, 246 years ago. Today is also Flag Day, the day we honor our flag. I hope everybody's flying their flag nice and clear. This coming Sunday is Father's Day. If you still have your father, be lucky enough, be sure to remember them. Now let's get into the show with our first introduction slide here so we can get who we are and what we're doing. There we are. We're telling the story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in it. We're trying to dispel the myths and the half-truths and downright lies. I am your host, Bill Dixon. I'm a Vietnam veteran 67 and 68. We're broadcasting courtesy of Nissan Communications and their worldwide headquarters in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have any comments, suggestions, or just anything you want to say, contact me at dixonbill80@yahoo.com. Now, if in doing the show, you want to participate during the live show and make comments or whatever, dial 919-518-9773. I'm going to give that to you again, 919-518-9773, and ask your question, make your comment, or whatever it is you like. Also, even better, if you want to go on to Skype and go to Computers 2K Voice. That's Computers 2K Voice, and ask your questions or make your comments or whatever. Again, thank you for tuning in. We're going to get started. We got one more thing we always want to do, the Veterans Crisis Line. If you are a veteran or you're the family member of a veteran, this can be a tough time with being locked up with COVID. Just talking the other day with some guys about a World War II veteran who's been locked up. He's 97 years old, and the pandemic, or whatever you want to call it, has really been hard on him. So we've been trying to visit him a lot. But if you're out there and you have a family member or a veteran, please, Veterans Crisis Line, 1-800-273-8255, and be sure to press 1 so you can get someone that's in the military. It's all confidential. Now, for the last couple of shows, we've been talking about the fall of Vietnam. We're going to talk about today a little bit about the fall of Vietnam, but I want to talk a little bit about, back up a little bit, kind of give you an update on the fall. In early 1975, North Vietnam began their final offensive towards South Vietnam. Now, they had done several little skirts around and so forth, just to see if the Americans were going to come back, like they said they wouldn't, but they told them South Vietnamese they would, but they did a little furry here and a little sort of here, and they kind of got the idea that Americans won't come back. So in 1975, they got out there and went all out for it. American officers who still remained in Saigon and South Vietnamese civilians were highly concerned about the rapid advance of North Vietnamese forces. Many feared that a bloodbath would take place when the communists arrived, like the Way Massacre in 1968. After the Tet Offensive in 68, they found mass graves of men, women, and children, then Way, teachers and politicians and so forth. At the end of March, many Americans were leaving the city. In early April, the number of Americans evacuated increased speedily as the government was planning for a complete evacuation of American presence in South Vietnam. U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin preferred an orderly and quiet evacuation. But this plan was opposed by many of the Pentagon who wanted to evacuate as fast as possible. Graham Martin waited right up to the last moment before he finally was ordered by the president to get his you-know-what on the airplane. Okay. Now, as they were trying to get the, knew that everybody was going to evacuate, they had all these children, a lot of them Amerasians were in the orphanages and so forth. So they wanted to ship those children out to different places and get them adopted. On April 3rd, the Operation Baby Lift which is the one getting the children out, was launched to evacuate about 2,000 orphans from Vietnam to the United States and other countries, including France, Australia, and Canada. The very first plane load of children crashed with few survivors on takeoff. It barely got off Tan Son Nhut Air Base before it crashed. The children on the latter flights were adopted by families around the world. Operation New Life was also launched that day. This operation was planned to evacuate about 110,000 refugees to the United States. Now, Operation Frequent Wind occurred on the last day of Saigon. That's the one that Ambassador Graham Martin sent out. That was all Americans were to head to the embassy. They played the song, a couple stanzas of White Christmas, which told everybody the secret word to get to back to the American embassy or their embassy as fast as possible. In this operation, more than 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. In other words, that day and for a little bit of the next day, 7,000 people left South Vietnam by helicopter because the planes couldn't get out. The communists had bombed Tan Son Nhut Air Base, and the runways were in such bad shape planes couldn't take out. But let's talk about the plane crash we just talked about. The picture on the right is a close-up of the plane, and the one on the left, you can see where it kind of drug across the ground. But that was the first flight out for Operation Baby Lift that they took. Took a lot of nerve to go out and go back and go out with another plane load. But we lost several men and women plus the children and doing that process. All right, let's see what we got next here. Oh yes. The ones who couldn't get out by Americans or get out before, trying to get out as best they could. Although thousands of people had been evacuated, there were still many South Vietnamese who wanted to leave the country because nobody knew what was going on when the communists were coming. Those who couldn't get evacuated by the United States had to manage to leave on their own. The cost for a passport and exit visa jumped sixfold, while the seagoing vessels' price tripled. And you see, they didn't have any problem putting enough, just jamming people on the ships and so forth who could pay. All right. Now, you see the picture there, the circle with the map. That is, if you look at the arrow, it shows Swan Lock. Swan Lock was about 30 miles from Saigon. You can see there, and just between Saigon and Swan Lock, you see Bien Hoa, which is where Long Binh Post was there. That's where I was at. And then you got Bearcat up there, but Bien Hoa was an air base. Then it's still an air base now. Now, on April 9th, the People's Army of Vietnam forces approached Swan Lock, a strategic city located 80 kilometers from Saigon. On April 20th, after fierce fighting with the ARVN, that was the South Vietnamese troops, 18th Division, the PAVN, People's Army of Vietnam, which was the communists, finally captured Swan Lock. Saigon now became their direct target. On April 21st, President Thu announced his tearful resignation on television. Vice President Tran Van Huong replaced him, yet quickly handed over to General Nguyen Van Minh, who was known as Big Men, so as to find a peaceful solution with the communists. Thu was already told that there would be no negotiations with him. So by getting out, he saved his butt, plus some money, I'm certain. But he also hopefully that the communists would do some negotiating, but they had no reason to negotiate. Saigon was surrounded by 100,000 communist troops. On April 30th, 1975, President Minh declared an unconditional surrender of his government. And you can see that there, the communists are all having a party at Swan Lock. Okay. Now, here's U.S. President Gerald Ford and U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. They are briefed by National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. Scowcroft on the evacuation of Saigon, April 28, 1975, at the White House in Washington, D.C. They're just sitting back on the couches, going, "What we're going to do with this Vietnam stuff? It ain't looking good." Evidently, they didn't do much of anything. Okay. All right, let's talk about the evacuation next. Oh, there you go. Upper picture, you see them getting on their, trying to come over the Vietnamese, trying to come over the wall because they had worked for the United States government, scared to death of what they were going to do. You see people lined up trying to get on the last helicopters. And when they got out to the the aircraft carriers and the ships, there was no room for all of them, so they had to start pushing off the helicopters off the side. Operation Frequent Wind was the final phase of the evacuation of American civilians and at-risk Vietnamese from Saigon. South Vietnam prior to takeover of the city by the North Vietnamese Army. Okay, everybody's trying to get out. Nobody knew what was going on and what was going to happen. Operation Frequent Wind was carried out on 29th and 30th of April 1975 during the last days of the Vietnam War. More than 7,000 people were evacuated by helicopter, and helicopters are somewhat limited in how many people they can take. So it was tragic. Everybody trying to get out. There were people. A helicopter landed someplace. They would swarm the helicopter. They had to beat people off, so they couldn't even get in and get people out that way. Pretty much had to, as you see there, at the embassy, had the fence and the barbed wire trying to keep people out so they wouldn't overload the helicopters. All right, let's see what we got next here. Yes, a little story here. Ba Van Nguyen was a major in the South Vietnamese Air Force with a wife and 3 children. None spoke English or had friends among the Americans, so visas were out of the question. In other words, you had to know somebody. By April 27th, the North Vietnamese had surrounded Saigon with 100,000 troops. Just before dawn on April 29th, the city's Sihanouk airport was attacked. With its runway and facility destroyed, escape by plane became impossible. There was only one way out of the city, a helicopter. Operation Frequent Wind had begun, an attempt to save as many at-risk South Vietnamese as possible. But what does a man with a wife and 3 children do? He can't get out of the embassy. Okay? Nguyen was desperate. His family lived in Saigon suburb, so he knew he'd never get to them and to any of the American evacuation points in time. There was too much traffic as people flocked to the city, hoping to flee with the Americans. All the people had Swan Lock, Benoit, and everybody was heading to Saigon. He told his wife to pack with what she could and to get ready. He was coming back. As the sun rose, he did so in a Chinook CH-47, the biggest chopper in the South Vietnamese Air Force. His family and his neighbors hopped on. Unfortunately, he couldn't understand what the Americans were saying on the radio. Not knowing where to go, he made an educated guess and headed out to sea. All right. Now, sitting out in the South China Sea, the USS Kirk, with the mission to protect the Americans' evacuation from the North Vietnamese Air Force. They knew people were coming out in Air Force and helicopters and so forth, and they didn't want the Communist Air Force to shoot them down there. On their radar, they began noticing these erratic blips on the screen. Within 20 minutes, the first chopper came crammed with refugees. Since the Kirk had a very small landing deck, they had to shove the helicopters off the ship to make room for the next. But the deck had an anti-skid surface. While the chopper's landing pads had rubberized grooves, it wasn't easy to task to get them off the helicopter. In fact, they were heavy, and they also were stuck to the thing. Nguyen was the 5th chopper to arrive, but when he saw them, they waved him off. The Chinook was too big. If it landed, its rotors would destroy the upper portion of the ship and hurt many or kill many others. So Nguyen stuck his head out the window while piloting the chopper. He managed to convey in crude sign language, which is interesting because it takes both hands and both feet to fly a helicopter, especially a Chinook, and he was doing sign language. He wanted to hover over the deck, and could some men please catch his passengers as they jumped off? All right, let's see. That's the area is. Now, here he's hovering just above the water. getting ready to jump out. But let's talk about the story just a second. Sailors rushed to the rear deck while wind had held his craft steady. He had to maintain a steady height of about 12 to 15 feet off the deck of a bobbing ship. If he flew too high, his passengers and the crew who caught them would get hurt. Too low, and the chopper's rotors would destroy the ship. Last to jump was the co-pilot, leaving the wind alone. He veered away from the kirk and settled the helicopter's wheel a few feet above the water. While still piloting the craft, he slowly took off his clothes, shoes, and holster gun. Wind then veered the chopper to the right as he jumped out the left door. He tried to stay under as the chopper crashed, desperate to avoid the exploding shrapnel and whirling rotors, but buoyancy kept forcing him to surface. The Chinook turned over, looming over wind before slamming back down with its wheels now pointed skyward. It was upside down. And you see there, that's him with the arrow right there in the red, covered probably a red blanket on the rescue ship where they picked him up. So that's a rescue boat shot off from the kirk and picked him up as sailors reached the spot that last saw wind. Then he was popped up out of the water, and he was unhurt. Best he could be unhurt from that situation. All right, let's see what we got next here. Okay, back to frequent wind. There is the famous helicopter picture of everybody getting on the helicopter there. But there's a little problem with this picture of what most people do. A group of people scale a stairway to a CIA helicopter on a rooftop in Saigon, April 29, 1975. The photograph of this event by a Dutch photojournalist became an iconic image of the war, symbolizing a desperate U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. The location of this evacuation has often been identified as a rooftop of the U.S. Embassy, but in fact it isn't. The people in the photograph were on the rooftop of an apartment building housing CIA officials and their families. The bottom picture there is the American Embassy, or was the American Embassy. The building that they're on, climbing up to the helicopter, that building is still there today. But the American Embassy building is gone. It's a huge office building there now, but the CIA building is still there. Now you see April 30th, the Russian, and then the bottom, the Russian tanks are bursting through the gates. After the fall of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, Vietnam became a unified country under control of North Vietnam's communist government, with Hanoi as its new capital. The government became unified, but not the people. First of all, they decided to rename the country the Democratic Republic of Vietnam to Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So it now is the Socialist Republic of Vietnam rather than the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, explicitly indicating the desire to follow socialism and then communism. Besides, the People's Revolutionary Party of South Vietnam was merged with Labor Party in North Vietnam, became Vietnamese Communist Party, the only party in Vietnam. The Vietnamese Communist Party leader's title was also changed from First Secretary of Term, a term used by Chinese communists, to Secretary General used by Soviet communists. You kind of get the idea they're kind of picking out which communist they were going to be following. Now, there is General, who was actually, at that time, he was president of South Vietnam. That's him. There you see with the arrow. When they attacked at dawn on April 30th, they met little resistance. North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, and the war came to an end. North Vietnamese Colonel Bui Tien accepted surrender from General Dong Van Minh, who had taken over after Tran Van Hong spent only one day in power. Tien explained to Minh, "You have nothing to fear. Between Vietnamese, there are no victors and no vanquished. Only the Americans who have been beaten. If you are patriots, consider this moment of joy. The war for our country is over." Or was that a lie, or he didn't know what he was talking about? Okay. This was the aftermath or beginning as it was coming in. You can see up there with the lady walking there. The South Vietnamese soldiers had started stripping down of their uniforms. They didn't want to see it in uniforms because they would get afraid they would get shot on sight. You can see that where they threw their rifles down. Nobody knew what was going on. Everybody was scared to death. Down in the picture, the big picture where the men are standing around there, it's the presidential palace. That's former South Vietnamese soldiers who are waiting to find out what was going to happen to them. And you can see the woman and the kids. Everybody's upset because nobody knows exactly what is going to happen when the communists come here and take power. Okay. Now, there it is. New York Times, communists take over Saigon. U.S. rescue fleet is picking up Vietnamese who fled in boats. And of course, my hometown paper here, the Raleigh Times. The war is over. Saigon is renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Despair, fear grip Viets here. I think that was Vietnamese that were living in the United States. But that was newspaper headlines all over the world that the communists had taken over. Okay. Unfortunately, the whole world just looked away from what was going on in former South Vietnam. They cut it off and nobody knew just what was going on. That's a good book you need to get if you want more story. The world looked away, Vietnam after the war, because of what the communists came in and did. Okay. Now, guys, all the South Vietnamese people are been knowing that the communists are coming and knowing that they have a tendency to kill anybody that's educated. You're a school teacher, you're a minister, or whatever. And this young lady lived it. She's 13 years old, and this is her story and her book. The war is over. The communists are pouring into Saigon. What was it like to the people of Saigon? And this is her story, and she told it. For millions of ordinary South Vietnamese, particularly residents of Saigon, April 30th, 1975 would be a day of trepidation and outright fear. What lay in store for the inhabitants of the city? Would the conquerors march in as liberators or conquerors? Would they embrace the population or would there be a bloodbath? No one knew. Arthur C.C. Tuitt Wynn was just 13 when Saigon collapsed and the world she knew changed forever. I have a 13-year-old granddaughter, and I can't imagine her going through this. Her 2016 book, Shock Peace, The Search for Freedom, documents her life for ordinary Vietnamese after the communist takeover. Here the author describes the tense, terrifying, and surreal hours before and after the North Vietnamese army occupied the city. And this is her telling the story. At around 10 a.m., President General Nguyen Van Minh announced a total and unconditional surrender. He asked for all armed forces of the Republic of South Vietnam to calmly cease hostilities and stay where they are. The morning dragged on, heavy with suspense after the announcement. There were people running in panic along the streets in every direction. Some were on foot, others on motorbikes. Their eyes were wild, their faces dull and expressionless, all seeming to hurry to get to their destination. But they didn't know where the destination was. There were South Vietnamese army soldiers passing my house. All looked tired and bewildered. There must have been a first who put down his M16 on the pavement in front of my house. And then every soldier who went past that point automatically laid down his gun on top of the previous one. By lunchtime, the pile was getting higher. The trickling of soldiers walking past seemed to increase in volume and more hurried by. Some even stripped off their uniform and putting them in a heap next to the discarded guns. Okay. There was not much happening after that. The streets were deserted again. It was past lunchtime, but no one was interested in meals. The family did not talk or move about the house, but sat around the divan, waiting in silence. Minutes later, the radio came alive with some unintelligible sound. Then a strange voice came on to the microphone with a thick, heavy northern accent, declaring their victory. President Min followed with his full-on declaration of defeat. After that, deadly silence fell upon the whole city instantly, snuffing out on all sounds at once. The strange atmosphere was unnatural, as it may have been seemed hours ago. But the eerie silence had increased in intensity after the radio announcement. Reality kicked in with such a forceful brutality that the shock was clearly visible on everyone's face. Air was still, willing everyone to stay frozen in its place. Without a word, everyone moved slowly out to the front door. On both sides of the boulevard, there were people standing still. The whole city was standing still. Then a chorus of fearful ohs broke involuntarily from the throats of the people as something materialized suddenly that they were afraid to see. Their terrified gazes were all directed towards a very strange-looking armored tank rolling down the street. The shape, the color, and the aura were so wrong. Its menacing power was clearly invisible. It carried the ominous-looking flag, half red and half blue, with the yellow star, and full red with the yellow star of the National Liberation Front and the Vietnamese Communist Party coming down the street. The adults exchanged brief glances. Everyone was trying to hide their shock and remain blank. No one dared to say anything, not even a whisper. The stunned and depressed looks of Saigon citizens were somehow unexpected by the communists, who thought they had given the Southerners a victory to rejoice in. That shocked silence was not allowed for long. However, the South Vietnamese citizens were forced to show jubilation and ecstasy and welcome the Northerners as enthusiastic traders and conquering soldiers, and to restore sound to the sepulchral atmosphere. The tank continued parading down the boulevard with the entourage of Northern Army soldiers. Some were on foot, others were on heavy Chinese buses and trucks. There were a group of people, unmistakably wearing familiar civilian outfits and obviously traders of the South, who appeared as if the victory was part of their reward. They were markedly different to the anonymous and peculiar-looking North Vietnamese soldier who carried his distinctive AK-47s on their shoulder and wore black rubber sandals. What you mean? Most soldiers seemed awkward and surprised at their victory. Their features somehow as stunned as the Southerners. On the other hand, the traders and camp followers were wild with excitement. Their eyes were ablaze with fire. Two of them were holding a large victory flag and running on both sides of the tank. Amidst the commotion, a commander with a North accent was yelling between gritted teeth to get the Southerners to cheer on. Then another voice answered with a Southern accent, from which I recognized as the cleaner of the school principal of my high school. Snappily, he urged the bystanders to follow his cheers. Victory to the National Liberation Front. In the camp followers' hands were a bundle of miniature National Liberation Front blue, red, and Vietnamese Communist Party red flags, which had been somehow clearly been organized well before in secret and now appeared literally in the open air. They started to distribute these to bystanders, pressing them to wave the flag and cheer on. Their commands were curt and compelling. Hours later, the flags were to be left on the front doors of Saigon residents as a strong reminder to the South of which side had now taken charge of the city. Moments later, the fierce heat of the April afternoon sun was marked by the sea of red communist flags. Some bystanders resignedly obeyed the orders to cheer on, but their eyes were still dulled by shock and their hands waved the blue flags awkwardly. They repeated the phrase with restrained expression like automatons. The parade went past. The commotion was short, but it left awkwardness in the rest of bystanders. They lingered on the streets for hours. The Southerners were still reluctant to look at each other. Their gazes averted quickly whenever their eyes met. Some turned their back and went inside in slow motion and subdued questions. A few stayed still, searching for something familiar, something from the nostalgic past, even though the past was just hours ago. One person on the opposite side of the street was silently scraping the painted on Republic of South Vietnam flag on his wall. As if on cue, the others followed suit. Then the rest of the street was busy scraping off their walls the symbol of the last government. The past was truthfully vanishing. My father looked on and sighed. He turned and urged everyone to come inside the house. No one dared to speak. Everyone was whispering as if the walls suddenly had ears, as if eavesdropping was a new practice acquired recently by every citizen in the new communist world. From the moment Saigon had fallen, the whole population of South Vietnam started whispering. They did not dare to congregate in public. A crowd of more than 3 or 4 were considered dangerous and might be accused of conspiring to rebel. And chances were that would be put in detention without further explanation. They talked in low, quiet tones inside their closed doors with only trusted members of the family or friends. They looked at each other and searched for signs of betrayal. Who was a communist and who was not? Their careful use of words when talking to strangers was distressing. Any misunderstanding and misinterpretations might be followed by disastrous results. Evening was slow. Time passed even more slowly than in the morning. The street in front was not as busy as it was at lunchtime, as if the curfew was still in place. That night, there was less noise than our previous nights. There was no more bombardment, but there was still occasional gunfire to be heard. A feeling of foreboding had fallen on the city since lunchtime. No one wanted to go to sleep. Everyone staying downstairs near the useless bomb shelters, but not inside. No one wanted to be separated from the family, perhaps out of fear. Togetherness seemed to be important to all of them at that time. Somehow, the terror of facing the northern Vietnamese communists increased in intensity with the passing hours. Even the children could sense the naked fear from the adults' outward appearance. I was curious about its unparalleled horror, even though it was so obscure, and strangely, the words were just communist and communism in my young mind. I could not understand the trepidation were real. To this day, I am still able to recall the terror of the fall of Saigon. From the memory of a young girl of 13, the fact of that appalling threat from the communists and communism is still vivid in my mind. All right, now that was the story of when and the fall of Saigon when the communists came through. I can't imagine just what it was like then, still not knowing what was going on. Realizing that you had to act like you were all for it if you don't. This is, as you can see there, that's a load of North Vietnamese soldiers coming in on another Russian tank. The black and white picture there is the former South Vietnamese soldiers being marched off to wherever. They didn't know what was going to happen to them. All they knew that they were going to go somewhere. Okay. Now, when the fall of Saigon, the communists came in and took over Saigon. There was a total blackout. They got rid of all the news media and everything. So nobody knew what was going on anywhere in the world, what was going on in Vietnam, period, especially Saigon. So people, with all this going on, I can tell you they were picking up, arresting people. People were telling on each other. People who had supported the South were being called in. They started the re-education camps, which we'll talk about the next show. But then you had all the people who tried to get out and couldn't. The families, the boat people. The boat people were just, what they went through is just unbelievable. We're going to talk about that. The next decade wouldn't be so easy for the capital of the now vanquished Southern regime. Saigon's name was changed to Ho Chi Minh City to honor the revolutionary leader who had declared independence in 1945. To the surprise of the native Viet Cong, who had been fighting for years to reunify Vietnam, Northern cadre members were brought in to oversee the installation of Soviet-style economy in the city and take over day-to-day rule. In other words, those people who had been from living in the South, the Viet Cong, had been fighting for the North to take over. They were mostly fighting for a nationalist government, not necessarily for a communist government. In the years after the fall of Saigon, as many as 400,000 Southerners who fought or worked for the ousted pro-American regime were rounded up and forced into re-education camps. Doctors, soldiers, engineers, businessmen, some of the very people who could have helped out the shattered country back together again were instead forced to perform back-breaking menial labor and pen mindless self-criticism. They had to talk about how bad they were and so forth over and over again in the re-education camps. Okay. Even North Vietnam allies, the former Viet Cong, those who were nationalists rather than communists, found themselves in the re-education camps to get their thinking right. They fought for the communists and went along with the communists, but they weren't quite thinking right because they were thinking nationalist as a republic, and the communists were thinking of communist regime. So they had to go to education camps also. After the invasion of China into Vietnam in a brief 1979 border war, anti-Chinese persecution were stepped up in Ho Chi Minh City, and thousands of Sholan shopkeepers began to trickle out of the country. Sholan was the Chinese section of Saigon. When I was there, it had a fantastic PX. PX was going to a shopping mall. But they didn't want the Chinese there. The new government took over production and banned all private businesses. Living standards in Ho Chi Minh City began to plummet, and the trickle of refugees fleeing Vietnam became a torrent. Late 1970s and 80s were the darkest period yet for Vietnam. Okay. Poverty tightened its grip on Vietnam as they had to pay China back for their war support by their rice production. What rice they were growing, the Chinese were taking. So there wasn't much left for the South Vietnamese. Nearly starving the Vietnamese people by 1970 and 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia to stop the murderous cross-border raids by Pol Pot's Khmer. The decade-long war that resulted nearly bankrupted Vietnam. Here they are, can't hardly feed their people, and they go out and get in a war with Cambodia, the Cambodian communists. At the same time, a decision to collectivize rice production devastated agriculture, and a United States-led trade embargo meant Vietnam had no access to much-needed international aid or capital. As Western nations turned their back on Vietnam, the country also found it increasingly difficult to communicate with the outside world. Thanks to the trade embargo, international telephone and even mail services was limited. As vendors had little to sell and residents had no money to spend, the once vibrant streets of Ho Chi Minh City emptied out. They did their own blackout, and then United States cut off everything else. 1 million people took their lives in their hands, attempting a dangerous escape by sea or land, desperate to get out of Vietnam. This is when the refugees start to run. Why? They're scared. The communists are capturing all those who are involved with the South Vietnamese government, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. If you were captured, then you left your family to go to prison. The South Vietnamese believed that they had to escape in order to give their families a future. How were they to escape? Well, here's one way. Put yourself in a small boat traveling across the ocean, not knowing where you're going, not knowing if your family, the family you just left behind in your home country, still lives, not knowing whether tomorrow you will be alive or dead. Your stomach is growling. You haven't eaten anything for days. The boat has run out of supplies, and the only water left is the salty ocean water. And you probably didn't know how to sail a boat to start with. As you lie at the bottom of the boat, exhausted, starving, and dehydrated, and unable to move, you're helpless. Thoughts begin to wander through your mind. Will you be safe? Will you reach a refugee camp? Will a violent storm erupt or pirates invade the boat? This is the suffering that many of the Vietnam War refugees had to go through. They didn't know what they were leaving, except they were leaving communism, and they got on a boat not knowing where they were going. The planning of this escape was very time consuming and could take a year or even 2 years. Refugees had to sell all their valuables in order to obtain money to buy equipment. The boats would normally be very small and made of wood for river travel, not ocean, and yet they had to fit up to 100 people for ocean travel. The moment of escaping at night was very frightening. The refugees had to move to the boats in small groups of 3 and 5 so that they wouldn't look conspicuous for the police did not spot them. They were either imprisoned or shot if they were captured. But sometimes other refugees would also steal the waiting boat. I have a friend of mine here. Her name is Lee. We call her Lee. Her name is Trung. She was a boat refugee at 12. Her family had bought a boat, but before they could get the boat, other people took over the boat, and the people who actually paid for the boat had to get on the best way they could, and most of her people got on with nothing whatsoever with them, and the first day out, the engine breaks down. But the boat was commandeered by other refugees. You had to be real quiet. When you're selling stuff, people would think, now, why are you selling this stuff? And so forth. So everybody's watching each other. Either way, their home and valuables would be confiscated, so they had nothing to go back to. And in case of Lee, her mother stayed behind. So if they did get caught, they'd have a home to go back to. Once the refugees had all arrived and boarded the boat, it was probably one of the worst experiences these refugees ever had. They were packed in like sardines. When they got seasick, where do you think they vomited? Right where they were, of course. They needed to go to the toilet. Where did they go? Right where they were. If that wasn't enough, there was the fear of the Thai pirates. They would invade the boat, steal all supplies, and kidnap the young women to be either raped or sold. The others would be left on the deserted island to die. Others' fears was that a huge thunderstorm would erupt or the boat would run out of supplies and everyone starved to death. But yet they keep coming. That's a picture of them. You can see there on the boat. They got a little bit of room there on that one, but you can see a lot of people, not much food, and so forth. Okay. Now there's one there's a boat that's completely loaded. It looks like I don't know how in the world it's even floating, and it says, "Have pity on us. Let us land, please." Because some places they went, they would not even let them land because there were so many people there. As you can see with the blue with the red striped boat, how loaded down that was. Can you imagine spending days? I mean, you can't lay down unless you do it in groups. But and they kept coming. Okay. But then there were pirates. There's some of them coming in. As you see there, they were coming aground. You can see some of them, the boats turned over. But then on top of all that were the pirates. Okay. Beginning 1975, excuse me, I can't even read my own stuff here. Beginning in 1975, more than 575,000 refugees fled the homes by sea. An unknown number have died or been kidnapped on the open water, never to be heard from again. These people are attacked by pirates with staggering violence and frequency. After the refugee boats that arrived in Thailand in 1983, as well as a smaller but still significant number that landed in Malaysia, had been victimized. These pirates are not the swashbuckling variety we see on TV in Disney World. Rather, they were common thugs and murderers on the high sea. They hurt people, almost casually, with women experiencing the worst of the violence. In October 1983, pirates repeatedly raped 23 of 25 Vietnamese girls and women aboard a boat during a 2-day attack. Some of the victims were hospitalized in critical condition. In 1980s, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees attempting to escape from Vietnam were massacred in the sea by Thai fishermen turned pirates. The way they killed these refugees, which has been documented, was obnoxiously cruel and brutal. Often the Thai pirates used hammer, machete, and guns that had killed the entire boat, including children and women. Some were simply dumped in the ocean to die slowly. At the time, while Western governments sent Navy ships to rescue refugees and combat these pirates, the Thai government took no action and was even obstructive to the rescue missions. None of these murderers were ever brought to face the weight of justice. The Thai government makes no attempt to even prosecute them. On April 27, 1983, a boatload of 31 men, women, and children fled Vietnam. Several days later, as they crossed the Gulf of Thailand, pirates robbed the unprotected boatload and then attacked a second time with even more grievous consequences. 3 women, aged 25, 26, and 30, were abducted. 12 of the group were clubbed, knifed, and thrown into the sea. Another 12 drowned. Their boat sank as the pirates attempted to tow it. This one boat, these 31 disfigured or lost lives, are but one episode of a continuing story. Attacks on boat people occurred as early as the first boat escaped in 1975. Their frequency increased as the number of boats multiplied and word spread among the southern Thai coast. Of boat people coming, often with their remaining and resources converted to gold or hard currency. And remember, they were leaving a communist country. Very few, if any of them, had guns, but they had results of selling all their goods on the boats. In 1981, 77% of the boats which left Vietnam and eventually landed in Thailand were attacked. 77%. In 1982 and 1983, the percentage were 65 and 56%, respectively. Motivated by the promise of booty of centuries-old racial antagonism between the Thai and the Vietnamese, the pirates' attacks take a variety of savage forms. Hundreds of victims have died, having been shot, knifed, beaten, or rammed. Some have committed suicide under duress. But people keep trying. If victims survive the first attack, a second one is virtually certain. The average number of attacks per boat has almost consistently exceeded the 2 after 1981 and had reached over 3 in some time periods. 3 different attacks by pirates. Children have told of beating or terrorized by pirates wielding hammers and knives. They have watched as their mothers were raped or abducted. Girls as young as 6 of age have been sexually assaulted. Clearly, young girls and women are victimized in disproportionate measure. Over a period of almost 3 years, ending in November 1983, nearly 500 persons reported as kidnapped or were females. Of that, fewer than half have ever been found. Abductees are often simply thrown overboard. Some women are sold into prostitution by the captors. Now, this is another one. I know you can't read it. I've got where I can read a little bit of it here. This is a story of a young man, a fisherman, but he was a fisherman. Like most of the other refugees, Hook said he had and 120 others set out from Vung Tau on the Vietnam coast in a 40-foot boat on about July 19th. He said he couldn't be sure of the exact date because he was still trying to remember what happened. The first 2 ships they encountered, he said, stopped and gave them food and water. He thought they were Thai ships. The third ship looked like a fishing craft, and there were women and children on board, he said. About 30 men aboarded the refugee boat, some armed with pistols, others with long knives, he said. They shouted at the refugees in a strange language, he said. All the Vietnamese, including the 30 women and 20 children, were forced to board the pirate ship. He said, where the robbers made all of them strip so their clothing could be searched. Other members of the pirate crew remained aboard the refugee craft and searched it from stem to stern. They took everything, watches, rings, bracelets. Then they put us back aboard our boat and went away. He said no one was hurt. The next day, books went on. Another pirate ship brought disaster. They were trying to board us. He said that, but the seas were heavy and it was difficult. That was when they tried to hook up and tow the boat away. but their boat hit Hong's boat and split in half, sinking immediately. People were screaming and shouting. I saw a piece of wood and grabbed it and hung on. He was the only one rescued. Another story of the boat people. Okay. There is a pirate ship coming up onto one of the Vietnamese ships. The pirates had radios and so forth, but the Vietnamese usually had nothing. Okay. The Vietnamese government celebrates the fall of Saigon as Liberation Day or Reunification Day, although the fall of Saigon is commonly used in Western accounts. Among overseas Vietnamese refugees, it's usually referred to as National Hatred Day or Black April. I have celebrated Black April here with the Vietnamese Americans. There's still more to the story. The re-education camps. On the 12th of July at 3 p.m. is our next Lessons of Vietnam show. We're going to be talking about the re-education camps. There's a movie that I'm going to highly recommend you get. I was just trying to see if I have it on my bookshelf where I could see it. But we're going to be talking about the re-education camps. Even when the boat people got here, they were not always treated well, especially down in Florida and Louisiana, where the Vietnamese fishermen came in and tried to fish, and the Americans who were already here felt they were interloping on their fishing, which they were. So there was a lot of fights and so forth when they got here, as far as trying to get settled in. A lot of them spent years in camps all over, trying to wait till they got a sponsor to come in. I know the Lutheran Foundation sponsored quite a few, but a lot of them were killed. Women were raped in these holding camps. Some of those were about as brutal as some of the camps that were in Vietnam. So giving you a couple of books that you might like to read to kind of get some ideas of just what it's all about and so forth, and just how bad the ones who stayed didn't know what was going on. I can't imagine, as I said, being in Vietnam the day that it fell, Vietnamese, that you lost your country, and all of a sudden you couldn't talk to your neighbors because you couldn't know who was going to tell what secret or so over. So everything kind of got, you were scared of your neighbors. You were scared of the comments coming in. Food was hard to get, if possible. Nothing was certain. People who were educated didn't know what was going on. By the way, when they took over the rice paddies and so forth, the communes, when they really started having problems with the rice, because you took people out of the city, you sent them out there who had never grown rice before and put them in a commune, and they had to grow rice. And the guy next to you may be goofing off, so why should you work? Why should you work any harder than him? Because you're always going to get paid the same. So they kind of slacked off, and they almost starved to death not having rice. So that's when the communist North Vietnamese communists got the idea, why don't we turn the rice paddies back over to the rice farmers and let them farm the rice? We still own the land. They can lease it from us. And when they did that, the rice farmers now are back on their land, and they can will that land, but they still have to pay taxes and so forth, and the lease to the communists. But the rice production has picked up greatly, because now the harder a person works, the more money they can make. But the rice farmer, even today, doesn't look like he's living a whole lot better than the rice farmer was back during the war. They're still living their huts out by the rice paddies and so forth, with the dirt floors, and but they all have a TV antenna or satellite dish out front, and a couple of motorbikes. So things have changed a bit, but just think what would happen here. There's all kinds of talks about revolution. Just think what would happen here. We have a revolution. Food's going to get hard to come by. Like I said, the Chinese came in and wanted to get reparations for what they did. But as you kind of got the idea, when the communists come in, they were not all forgiving like they said they were. They went out of their way to punish the former South Vietnamese, whether they were in the military or whatever, because they had fought them. all along. So they did whatever they could. They would take whole truckloads of former soldiers out, shoot them, and bury them in mass graves, or send some of them to re-education camps for long periods of time we're going to talk about. But that's the show today. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope I enlightened you a little bit what happened. I'm not certain that enjoy would be the word to use because of all the tragedies and so forth, but the boat people. But next time you see a boat family, a Vietnamese family, think about it. Just what a lot of them, the older ones went through. It had to be terrible. I mean, I talk with Lee from time to time, and like I said, she was 12 years old, and on that boat, and what they went through. The boat broke down. Finally, they were picked up by a Filipino boat. Luckily, the pirates didn't get there, or she probably wouldn't be here. But they're looking forward to seeing you again on the show. Tell all your friends about our new time and date. We're now the second Monday at 3:00. That you were always been. You can also go on to our show on the website, Amnon Communications, for all of our shows in the past. I'm getting tongue-tied here. So you have a great Father's Day coming up, and we'll see you the next show in 12th of July. And goodbye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.